This is Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski. Here now, Tony Brueski.
The newest development in the case of Austin Robert Drummond is the kind that instantly shifts the ground under everyone's feet. A Lake Country grand jury has handed down a sweeping indictment. 4 counts of first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and 1 set of felony firearms charges. And prosecutors say they will pursue the death penalty. That declaration doesn't come lightly. It signals the state believes the case isn't just strong, it's overwhelming. They're telling the court and the public that this wasn't a moment of chaos or confusion. This was deliberate violence. But nothing in this case is simple once you move past the paperwork. Because while prosecutors are building a capital murder case, Austin Drummond is building something else entirely, a story. A story where he's not a killer, but a covert asset. A story where the state he's now fighting against is the very system he was supposedly helping. A story so dramatic that it forces a question at the heart of what we're talking about today. Is this a mentally unstable man or a calculated criminal performing instability because he knows it might save his life? It's probably one of the two. Or a little bit of both. To even explore this question, you have to start at the place where everything broke open. It's July 29th of this year, 2025, and we're recording this. A homeowner in rural Dyer County calls police after spotting a baby girl about 7 months old sitting in her car seat in the middle of her front yard by the mailbox. It's the kind of call that stops dispatchers cold. A child alone, strapped in as if someone had just lifted her out of a vehicle and walked away. Deputies arrive, identify the child, and quickly realize her parents, James Matthew Wilson and Adrianna Williams aren't accounted for. Hours later, in a wooded patch outside Tiptonville, 40 miles north, officers find the bodies. Wilson, Williams, her teenage brother, Brandon, and her mother, Cortney Rose, 4 victims, concealed under camouflage tarps. A murder scene that wasn't rushed or sloppy. Someone took the time to cover the bodies. This wasn't a frantic explosion of violence. It was seemingly controlled. And within a short window, one name emerges repeatedly as both a known associate of the victims and someone with the means and opportunity to carry out the killings. Austin Robert Drummond. As investigators at this point start pulling digital data, they assemble the path they believe he took, present in Lake County around the time the victims were last seen, present in Dyer County around the time the baby was abandoned, traveling south towards Jackson, where he was eventually arrested after a multi-day manhunt. From beginning to end, the pattern looks a bit intentional, but intention is exactly what Drummond is trying to rewrite. Because as soon as he was in custody, before the courts imposed a gag order, he started telling a very different version of events, one where he wasn't running from a murder, but from a threat. One where he wasn't the killer, but the target. One where he wasn't a suspect, but an undercover operative whose cover had been blown during an operation involving gangs and corrupt officials. Oh yeah, that tracks, doesn't it? All those stories we hear about those undercover operatives being outed, that all seem very mentally stable. It's a story that demands attention, not because it has evidence behind it, but because it has style. It's cinematic, complex, slightly tragic. It lets him play the role of someone trapped inside a larger conspiracy. And when you hear it, you're forced to ask, does this man believe this? Or does he just know we'll wonder whether he believes it? The reason that question matters, the reason it's even plausible, is tied directly to his past. Drummond has spent most of his adult life in custody, or in and out of it. His first major conviction came at 17 after an armed robbery in Jackson. That's where the pattern starts. He told the parole board he'd been high on Xanax, and he couldn't remember the robbery. It wasn't his fault. It was the drug. The court didn't buy that. But inside the system, he adapted quickly. Over roughly a decade in prison, he accumulated more than 24 disciplinary infractions, assaults, weapons, possession, gang activity, contraband. It wasn't quite misconduct either. It was a kind that tracks with someone who needs control in an environment where control is currency. He picked up retaliation charges for threatening jurors and victims connected to the original robbery case. He was denied parole in 2020, but released in September of 2024 after serving most of his sentence. His record at the time of release was a red flag factory: violence, defiance, rule breaking, manipulation. And soon after release, reports indicate he was out on bond for a separate violent offense. The system kept giving him air, and he kept turning that air into smoke. Then 4 people were killed, and a baby was left alive in a place she'd been found. That detail, the baby, isn't incidental. If Drummond were in a psychotic episode, the crime scene would likely look very different. Psychosis often leaves chaos in its wake: disorganized scenes, impulsive behavior, unpredictable victim selection. But here, the infant was spared, not just spared, delivered into a situation where she would survive. You don't need empathy to do that. You just need reasoning. Some awareness of consequence, some awareness of optics. The tarps matter too. They tell a story of someone who wanted the bodies hidden, someone who understood the difference between exposed and concealed, someone thinking about what comes next. When prosecutors talk about especially heinous atrocities and cruelty, they're describing the violence. But when they talk about premeditation, they're describing behavior. Behavior that looks thought out, not delusional. And this is where Drummond's undercover informant claim hits its psychological breaking point. If this were the first time he'd invented a self-serving narrative, maybe you could squint and see the outline of a delusional belief system. But it isn't the first time. It's part of a long chain of revisionist storytelling. I couldn't remember the robbery. I was unfairly targeted in prison. I wasn't responsible for my disciplinary write-ups. I misunderstood. I'm the victim. Now it's, I was undercover and the government betrayed me. The theme remains the same. The facts are wrong, the system is wrong, and he is right. That's not delusion, that is self-preservation. It's probably some delusion mixed in there too. And the timing of this newest narrative isn't incidental. It arrived only after he became the prime suspect in a quadruple homicide. Only after the evidence began to line up against him. Only after the manhunt ended and he landed in a jail cell facing the kind of charges that make people reach from the closest possible escape hatch. And that hatch may be a sheet and rolling off a top bunk. From a legal standpoint, mental illness is not whatever a defendant claims, it's whatever can be documented. And in Drummond's case, there is no documented history of psychosis, delusions, or instability. No medication history, no hospitalizations, no competency questions raised by the court. Nothing in the record supports the idea that he lost touch with reality. Not to say he hasn't, but that's what there's evidence of. Or not. But there's a mountain of evidence supporting something far less ambiguous. A man who's relied on manipulation for most of his life because it usually worked. And that right there, that's the irony here. His strategy is failing not because it's outlandish, but because the case against him is too solid. Cell data, known relationships with the victims, a baby whose abandonment lines up with his phone's movement, a crime scene that wasn't the product of a fractured mind but a calculating one. This is why prosecutors are confident enough to pursue the death penalty, not because the crime was brutal, though it was, but because the behavior around it suggests awareness and intention. The moral and legal responsibility is intact, and they're saying, this man needs to leave the planet. But this story isn't just about him. It's about the system that kept clearing paths for him to walk down. The parole warning in 2020 wasn't vague. It wasn't hesitant. A district attorney put it in writing. Releasing Drummond posed a threat to public safety, and yet he was released. Then he was bonded out on another violent offense. Then 4 people ended up dead. We like to think violence arrives out of nowhere. The killers snap. Something breaks. But sometimes the truth is more boring and more terrifying. Sometimes you see it coming. Sometimes you're warned. Sometimes the system simply refuses to believe the danger is as real as it is. And then you end up with a baby sitting alone in a front yard. That's why the question of mental illness versus manipulation isn't academic here. It matters. It's the difference between a case where tragedy feels senseless and a case where it feels preventable. If Drummond were psychotic, this would be a failure to identify a man coming apart. But nothing about his history suggests a man unraveling. It suggests a man refining. The cleaner, more consistent interpretation. The one that matches his record, his conduct, his crime scene, and his shifting stories. Is that this isn't mental illness, it's strategy. Bad strategy, but strategy nonetheless. And in the courtroom, strategy collides with evidence. A jury will eventually decide what to call Austin Drummond, insane or culpable, misled or malicious. But the case as it stands doesn't look like a collapse of reality. It looks like a collapse of opinions and options. A man cornered by his own past and trying to invent a future where he is not the villain. That's why this story feels so dramatic. It's not the story of someone who lost touch with reality. It's a story of someone trying to rewrite it. What do you think? Are we crazy? Does Austin know something we don't? People like that are interesting because they make sane people, people who are willing to look into claims, aren't just dug into, here's what the facts are, even if I'm not quite sure. It makes you look, and then you start looking, and then you start digging, and then you start finding, and then you start seeing a pattern. And seeing the pattern is what is key. Because it's easy to look, wow, what if this is a conspiracy? Wait a second, look at this guy's pattern of manipulating people. And he's saying this now? It tracks to this pattern of BS and nothing else. Austin Drummond, what we know of him. You think the FBI would trust him with anything? We've talked with 2 FBI agents on this show already about this case. And they laughed at the idea of anyone in the FBI using this guy for anything. But why did he do it? Why would you go and take out 4 people, save the baby? What's the motive here? It's not a secret FBI spy ring, I'll tell you that much. Your thoughts in the comments section. Love to hear them. Until next time, I'm Tony Brueski. We'll talk again real.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Brueski and the Hidden Killers podcast.